culture, but we also need to consider dominant culture anywhere in the world. So what are the characteristics of dominant US culture? I'm aware that there are plenty of cultures that have mixed in the United States. So if you're thinking about dominant US culture, how would you define the most clear, unspoken, probably, cultural norms that we would have as Americans? I might say individualism, like I talked about. I also might say entitlement. There is certainly an element of we think that we deserve certain things and should be given certain things. And so I think that's certainly something that we have to be careful of, if nothing else. And then I'd like you to consider these 3 questions. And if you want to answer one of these in your reflection post, I'd be happy to read some of your thoughts. If you consider characteristics of dominant US culture, how were those values passed along to you? In other words, what do you define as a cultural norm? And then how were those values passed on to you? Where did they come from? Where can you trace the root of that value back to? And secondly, what values in your parents' era seem to have lost importance or changed? And, every generation says that this one is worse than the one before. And that's been going on for decades, I'm sure, maybe even centuries. So, I'm sure that as we have children and watch them grow up, we're going to say, oh my gosh, their generation's so much worse than ours, which our parents have said that about us. So I'm interested to hear what you think are the values from your parents' eras that are no longer important or have changed in some way. And then finally, what values do you think will go forward from their generation? So what are things that you think are current values that we have still maintained and or that we will continue to maintain? Our world is constantly changing, constantly evolving, and cultural norms and influences are constantly changing. So what values have been consistent? What has, remained throughout all of these changes? Okay, so here's somewhat maybe a controversial question, but how important is it for people who visit or live in another country to adapt? In other words, let's put this in first person first. If you were to visit or move to another country, how important is it for you to adapt? And then if we think about it in third person, how important is it for someone who comes to the United States, either to visit or to live, to adapt? So consider that. If you want to post about that, feel free. How important is that? And then kind of as a follow-up to that, who should do the adapting? And I'm going to leave it at that because I don't want to influence your thoughts. So how important is it for people to adapt, and who should do the adapting? So ponder that. Okay, cultural values. There are 4 main variables in cultural values. And so basically what I'm going to show you here are these 4 variables. Any culture that you choose internationally will fall. You need to look at these as either a spectrum or a continuum. So it's not necessarily this or this, but it's more there's a graduated spectrum, and the culture will fall somewhere in between on all 4 of these variables. And we'll actually go through each one of them, but these are just the 4 of them just to bring them up. So masculine versus feminine perspectives, we'll talk about that. Tolerance of uncertainty versus avoidance of uncertainty. Concentrated versus decentralized distribution of power. And individual versus group achievement. So, like I said, anytime you are aware of a culture, or you're immersed in a culture, or you are learning about a culture, you will be able to identify based on this spectrum or this continuum that they will fall somewhere on these 4 variables based on their culture. So if we look at masculine versus feminine first, masculine cultures value achievement, assertiveness, heroism, and material wealth. And males base friendship on shared activities rather than talking. So masculine cultures are going to be very success driven. They are going to be assertive. They're going to be clear with what they want. Heroism is really big. They value that. They are inspired by that. And material wealth, so your possessions, your status, those types of things. Now, if we look at specifically the individuals in that culture, males base friendship on shared activities rather than talking. If you think about, I'll just throw this out there, clearly, United States is a masculine culture. So if you think about what do guys do together, if they're friends, they go play golf, they go play sports, they go fish, they go hunt, they go play video games, they go play paintball, whatever. It's very evident that they have friendships based on shared activities. Now, sometimes they do talk during those activities, but that's not the focus of what they're doing. Okay, so, oh my gosh. All right, feminine cultures value relationships, caring for the less fortunate, and overall quality of life. So relationships are paramount. In other words, it's not necessarily about status, success, achievement, but it's about the one-on-one interaction and the significance of that. Caring for the less fortunate, certainly something that is important and valued, and then overall quality of life. So certainly more socialistic in concept, not to say that all feminine cultures are socialist cultures, but the idea that everyone contributes to the greater quality of life for everyone else. That's really important. There's not that individualistic focus. And women approach communication for the purpose of relating to others, which makes sense because if we're talking about valuing relationships and caring for the less fortunate, those tend to be feminine characteristics and not feminine in the sense of culture, feminine as in women tend to be the ones who are more relational and more caregiving in their roles. So that would make sense that women approach communication to relate more. So then the difference between tolerance of uncertainty and avoidance of uncertainty. I have to say this was a little difficult for me to wrap my brain around at first. So you may have to read this part in the text and you may have to read through this a few times to fully understand the concept, but a higher tolerance has a culture with a higher tolerance has a relaxed, informal level of expectation of others, while avoidance of uncertainty in a culture requires more certainty, enforcing of rigid rules of behavior, and developing elaborate codes of conduct. And so let me just kind of make that a little more simple. So if you have a tolerance of uncertainty in a culture, you are okay with knowing that you don't know everything, which allows you to be more relaxed, and you don't have as high of expectations of others or yourself. So it tends to be a little more laissez-faire, c'est la vie, just a little more laid back in the acceptance of not knowing everything, not having all of the answers, and that's okay. So I think you all can understand the concepts of tolerance and avoidance. Those aren't necessarily unique, but the idea of tolerance of uncertainty within a culture, it kind of gets a little wordy and complicated. So if you just try to think about tolerance would mean you have an acceptance. Avoidance means you don't want to deal with it. So if you don't want to deal with uncertainty in a culture, you then are going to enforce more rigid rules of behavior and have elaborate codes of conduct. And so hopefully that makes sense. What are some examples of uncertainty in everyday life within a culture? And tolerance and avoidance aside, what are some uncertainties that we have in everyday life? That might help you grasp the concept a little better if you can identify what we might be uncertain about and then see where we would fall, whether we would be tolerant of that or avoidant of that. Okay, so remember, we're still talking about the 4 values of the culture. So we've talked about the first two, concentrated versus decentralized, is third, which basically means power in the hands of a few people versus equality and even distribution of power in government and organizations. So if we have concentrated culture, it means that power remains in the hands of very few people. If we have decentralized culture, then there's even distribution of power in government and organizations. So I think that that's pretty intuitive about, what that would look like. Now, to take that a little further and to do some more analysis of it, what are some benefits or costs associated with each? What would be benefits and costs for a concentrated power differential versus a decentralized power differential? I'd be interested to hear what you think about that, especially if you have experienced two cultures. If you grew up somewhere else or you've lived somewhere else, what you could certainly see the pros and cons more readily than someone that's only ever experienced one culture. So please share if you have some thoughts on that. And finally, individualistic versus collectivistic culture. And obviously, I think that's pretty straightforward. Individualistic cultures value the individual, collectivistic cultures value the common good. So, two questions that I am posing to you. Are individual achievements and accomplishments valued, or does the culture value group and team collaboration? So that's kind of the way that you can identify which culture, where it falls. But then what are cultures that would fit each? So give me some individualistic cultures, give me some collectivistic cultures, and the way that you can determine that, are the individual achievements and accomplishments valued more highly, or does the culture value group and team collaboration working together? So if we talk about cultural context, it's information that is not explicitly communicated through language, but through environmental and nonverbal cues. And we spent a lot of time talking about nonverbal cues. We spent a lot of time talking about the context and the environment. So this is not new information, but it is new in a sense of the cultural element. So it's information that is not explicitly communicated through language. In other words, every culture has idiosyncrasies and innuendos and gestures and things like that that are unique to the culture, and because they're not verbally communicated, an outsider would have a very difficult time understanding what those certain things are. I actually was watching a video, I think it's called International Business Minute, and they literally interview a business expert that's very culturally aware for 60 seconds, and that's all they get. So it's very, very short little clips. But what's interesting is he was talking about how Americans in a business context often shoot themselves in the foot, which is interesting because I'm using an American idiom that other cultures wouldn't know right there. And he's talking about how idiomatic expressions, and what that means is an idiom is something unique to a culture, a phrase or a concept that's unique to a culture. So an idiomatic expression is something that would not, basically the easiest way to think about it is if you were trying to translate it into another language, it doesn't have a direct translation. I speak Spanish, and so, my husband will often say, well, how would you say that in Spanish? And there are certain times when it's very, very difficult. Like, for example, I just said that you're shooting yourself in the foot. If I were to directly translate that into Spanish, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot. A Spanish-speaking person would say, who has a gun that's going to shoot me in the foot, or where am I going to get a gun to shoot myself in the foot? That is a very specific concept unique to Americans. And so in this video clip, he's talking about all of the sports references that we use. We say, give me a ballpark figure, or you're out in left field, or, we hit a home run, or it was a slam dunk, or we couldn't get to first base, whatever. There's all of these sports references that we use, and while someone that's familiar with that specific sport, Japanese